Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of the Oceania chapter of System Dynamics Society. Today's presentation is wider than freshwater, how non-freshwater related activity can indirectly influence and have impact on freshwater outcomes. I have asked ChatGPT to produce an introduction for a speaker based on his website, and this is what I got. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Justin Connolly, joining from New Zealand. Justin is the director of Deliberate, a consultancy that specializes in helping organizations navigate complex challenges. With a background in system thinking and system dynamics, Justin works closely with decision makers, policy advisors, and business analysts to bring clarity to multifaceted issues. His expertise lies in facilitating collaborative processes and guiding teams toward a shared understanding of trade-offs and implications in decision making. Justin holds a master's of management from the University of Waikato and the Bachelor of Arts from the University of Auckland. Through his work at Deliberate, he has made significant contributions across environmental and urban issues, partnering with local councils, government departments, and research institutes. Yeah, that's it, what I got from ChatGPT. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Hussein, and thank you, ChatGPT, for the wonderful introduction. Kia ora koutou, everybody. Thank you for the time. Thank you for giving up your time to be here. Just before I move on to the presentation, I thought I'd give a little perspective on what I was hoping to present. So the work I'm about to talk about, which I can show you the first slide from, is effectively an opinion piece that myself and some other colleagues from Manaki Whenua did. We called it Wider Than Freshwater, using a systems thinking approach to think about impacts on freshwater. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the New Zealand science industry, Manaki Whenua, or Landcare Research, is one of our Crown Research Institutes. So that's kind of like a national laboratory in the States, or like CSIRO in Australia. And we have a range of, they're all split up here and focus on different sort of subject matter areas. So Manaki Whenua is more about land and water quality and native flora and fauna. And from a system dynamic society point of view, I often get questions around, or people are often interested in how I do my work, which is usually in the qualitative space. So I pretty much usually just working in the qualitative causal loop diagram space, a little bit in the modeling space, but more so in the qualitative. So what I thought I would do is I would just give the same presentation which myself and my co-author colleagues gave to a lay audience. So that gives a sense of the way that we are communicating the concepts to an audience that doesn't align with or understand the systems thinking or system dynamics perspectives. And I've got a couple of slides at the end where I've just got the causal loop diagrams if people wanted to ask more specific questions about that, or perhaps questions about the process. And so thank you all for coming. I'd like to begin with a little story. And that is that when I was young, I wanted to be a detective. I could often be found investigating things around the house through my father's magnifying glass. If I looked at them through that glass, my parents would have seen me squinting, one eye closed and the other magnified to comedic proportions through the lens. As I grew into a teenager, I loved reading detective books and or watching detective TV shows, and I won't name them because that will date me too much. But if I, like in all good detective stories, the case is nearly always more complicated and nuanced than what it seems like at the start. Over time, I came to realize that a good detective didn't only look through the magnifying glass at what was perhaps obvious, but they also put that down, opened their other eye, and looked around them to understand the wider context of how things related to what they were investigating. Now, many decades later, myself and colleagues work to apply such detective skills to freshwater, which is resulting in this report. Wider than freshwater, how non-freshwater related activity can indirectly influence and have impact on freshwater outcomes. This is a joint report between Manaaki Whenua and Deliberate. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors who aren't here today, but so I'm Dustin, obviously, I've been introduced. Melissa Robson Williams and Nick Kirk are both researchers at Manaaki Whenua Lanka Research based in Christchurch in New Zealand, if anybody's familiar with that, where that is. What I'll cover is why we did this work, our approach and methods, which is obviously the systems dynamics part, key insights and practical applications that we see for people and would encourage, and then some conclusions, and we can wrap up with a discussion. So why have we done this work? Well, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've been experiencing issues with our freshwater in recent decades. It has received a lot of attention at a political level. Water quality is often lower than desired and can be unsuitable for swimming or other uses. And pressures on how much gets used by humans is increasing. Even though we are a relatively water-rich company, I have to say, compared to some of our Australian colleagues, we still experience many of those same pressures. We recognise that the discussion around freshwater issues was sometimes narrow and potentially excluded a range of influences and factors that could be having an impact. So we sought to widen the perspective on the related factors that influence and impact the state of freshwater. We sought to highlight what can be seen through the metaphorical magnifying glass and what can be seen when putting that down and looking around at the context. The hope is that this may help contribute to more coordinated and impactful policies that contribute to improved freshwater outcomes across the board. So our approach and methods, what did we do? So we've used a systems thinking and systems dynamics approach. I won't go into the detail of that with this audience, but it has allowed us to be participative in the design of the work, synthesize cause and effects across a wider range of subject matter areas rather than perhaps diving into deeper analysis, identify feedback loops of influence and how these may interact, presenting as trends over time, and also gone into articulating a range of leverage points of increasing impact. So there's two groups of influences that we identified within the report. Firstly, specific and proximal. So these are those that we were able to map onto a causal loop diagram effectively. And then there was broad and underlying. And these were more difficult to map on a causal loop diagram, but sort of spoke more to values or political influences and some of those sorts of things, and influenced many places in the causal diagram. So that's the broad differentiation of how we've represented these things in the report. I'll begin with the specific and proximal influences, so those in the CLD. There are things that are usually seen through the magnifying glass, so we articulate these as those things that are normally included in the policy discussions around freshwater outcomes. So visually, with some of the use the visuals from the report here. Excuse me. Those are the obvious things, you know, relating to rainfall, ecosystem health across the length of catchments, water use, both for municipal use and for farm use, things and policies and interventions like water storage at a farm level, as well as things like activities that occur on land. A lot of the freshwater issues are, a lot of the focus is on productive land or land used for productive human use, if I say that better. So farming type activities. So there's nutrient inputs, the types of animals being grazed or grown, the types of crops being grazed or grown, the amount of fertilizers being used, the amount of runoff occurring, the planting, riparian planting of streams, etc. Which is for those not familiar, is plant and planting that buffers the runoff of things from land into streams and rivers. There's also the financial component of things that's usually included from a farmer's perspective or a land user's perspective. So the very real impacts, not just of how much nutrient or stock or whatever is on land or is being used, but the financial return from that, the production that comes from that, and the viability of businesses associated with working on the land. So those are the specific and proximal, but within the magnifying glass. And we've shown them on our wider causal diagram here as a bunch of connections in this grayed out area with a gray background. So these are the things that are normally included in freshwater policy conversations. And there's huge depth in these, of course, and huge areas of focus, and sometimes entire plans in some councils or municipalities specifically on those areas. So we're seeking to widen that conversation slightly to how they connect with other things. So still within the specific and proximal area, things that are on the causal diagram, but putting down the magnifying glass of freshwater only and looking more widely at other things that have a context and have an impact. And in the visual diagram, this includes things like the nature of urban form and urban and suburban expansion and the pressure between urban form and land and what that means in terms of land use. The role of green infrastructure, both in cities and in rural areas. That's perhaps one that might sound like it's normally in the conversation. It sometimes is, and it sometimes isn't. So that one's perhaps a little bit of a borderline one. How we get around in terms of transport, you know, the conversations around transportation, rapid transportation, in private vehicle use, etc. The role of forestry and permanent forestry, greenhouse gas emissions, where we get our energy from and how we use our energy, and how things are connected to overseas supply chains, particularly with relation to that as well. And whilst we often talk about the financial returns with farmers, we're often quite silent on the implicit growth imperative that is implied in any business, but if we're talking about farming. So the need to grow and the need and the pressure that will put on the ability or the sort value extracted from land, and therefore the pressure that brings on nutrients and some of these other pressures over time. And so those are all the things that we've tried to widen the conversation slightly and have included in this causal loop diagram. So those are all the areas not shaded with a grey background. And what we're hoping in this report is that people can start to at least draw some of those connections between some of those areas to help make more effective policy. So the other types of key insights that we talked about were the broad and underlying influences. Sorry, there's the whole picture all up. I forgot that slide. And so the other type of influences that is the broad and underlying influences. So these were a range of influences which we had difficulty capturing on a CLD, but perhaps speak to some of the more subtle types of influences around, as I said, attitudes, values, greater trends that might be impacting lots of places on the causal diagram. And we approach these in narrative form in the report. So these cover things like the appropriateness of policy design processes in central local government. You know, there are wider questions in New Zealand around how well the system, excuse the pun, of central and local government is operating, how well people are engaged with that. The changing, or I dare say declining, trends of trust in science and policy that has developed. You know, there's a lot of misinformation, false information. The length of political and funding cycles have an impact. Both our national level government, we don't have state level in New Zealand, if our Australian colleagues are not familiar, we only have local government and central government, what you would call federal government. And both of those work on a 3-year electoral cycle, and obviously that influences funding cycles to a similar nature as well. And the willingness to give away decision-making power. So that speaks to the extent that participatory processes are used in decision-making or not, how well they are used, if they are used. those sorts of things. The importance and measurements of non-financial returns. So again, widening the lens on what is value, not just things that return $1. And at a personal level, for a lot of people, there's a declining level of ecological literacy. So there's perhaps a need for more time to be spent in nature. There's a declining level of time spent in nature, a declining level of familiarity with natural processes, which both has an impact on how aware people are, or how I guess in part how much trust they provide or give to the discussion around policy and the issues. But it also has a very separate to that, it also has a very important impact on human mental health and well-being. Social justice and inequality came up from a couple of people, which was quite interesting. And that was important because there was this interesting relationship between inequality or ability to implement even well-designed policy might be derailed if social justice and inequality issues lead to unrest or other issues within society. Climate change is a risk, and greater appreciation of climate resilient on farms, and a lower energy future. So just, excuse me, recognizing that the energy transition is not simply a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but in part also a transition from fossil fuel generation of energy to renewable energy generation, and also a lower level of energy, because we are beyond the bubble that has been provided by tapping into the fossil fuel energy literal bubble underground. I should say too, sorry, I neglected to mention at the start, before I go on to talking about leverage, in terms of our process, my personal practice is often group model building based. This particular project was more expert interview based, and myself and my colleagues brought all of those things together and then reflected our draft back to the experts that we had interviewed. And they came from a range of perspectives outside of the freshwater policy discussion, because me and my co-authors have good experience in the freshwater space. One is a biophysical scientist and has spent a lot of time in freshwater, and the other is a social scientist who's spent a lot of time researching freshwater processes and decision making. So we sought to get perspectives from people who are coming from an energy perspective, and from a social equity perspective, other people around the motu, as we say here, around the island, around the country. So in the electricity perspective, the urban perspective, some of these other research areas. So sorry for neglecting to mention that earlier. The presentation now pivots to talking about the varying degrees of leverage which we highlight in the report. Now, most people here will be familiar with the concept of leverage points, of course, most eloquently articulated by Danella Meadows, in my opinion. But just as a quick reminder, just this concept that there's shallower and deeper, or perhaps slightly powerful and more powerful places to intervene in a system, depending on how you conceptualize that system, in order to make change in that system. So we take time in the report to categorize Danella Meadows' 12 leverage points into sort of 3 groupings, which we call tweak the system. So those are the shallower ones, kind of more your rates, parameters, buffers. Change the rules of the system. This is more in the feedback loops, a little bit of power dynamics in the system, some of the rules of the system, and the deeper leverage points in terms of change the goals of the system. So what's the paradigm that's actually holding a whole bunch of these connections and things together? How might that change, and how might that produce quite different outcomes? The point we're making to a lay audience here is that intervening in the shallower areas is often direct. It often appears more proximal to the freshwater issues in terms of rates of use or buffer stocks like water storage, And conceptually, it's easier, but it might often be more expensive and less impactful. And whereas further up in terms of the goals, some of the deeper leverage points, that might be slightly more political capital expended, but not necessarily so much financial capital to make movement there. We identified over 30, and I have a link at the end of the presentation for people who might be interested in downloading the report. But we'll just give 2 or 3 examples per each of these 3 levels: the tweak, the change the rules, and the change the goals. So, sorry, get rid of those animations. So in the lower leverage areas, the tweaks to the system, some examples we identified were things like water storage. So water storage policies, again, for people who are not familiar in a rural context, I'm sure this is happening in Australia as well. So they will harvest or draw water in times of high flow, store it in massive big dams or reservoirs effectively, providing a buffer for continued use of that water or irrigation during drier times or times of lower flow of streams or rivers. However, water storage only increases the temporary buffer of water available. It doesn't mean that it's not impactful, but it doesn't fundamentally change the water dependent characteristics of the farming systems that are dependent on water. So that was why we characterized that one in particular as a lower leverage area. And this is, we expect this to prompt discussion because water storage policies are things that are getting a lot of traction around our country, and many have already been implemented. So there's this potential to reframe some of that conversation for a deeper exploration. Water use efficiency, so interventions that improve water use efficiency. Again, they only improve or reduce the water use or absorption rate. And that could also apply to some of the cultivars that are used as well. So changes in the water use retain the same general farming systems, and efficiencies may even encourage higher water use in the longer term through the often talked about dynamic known as Jevons paradox. It's an economic concept many people are probably familiar with, but it's a rebound effect, effectively. If you are able to use something more efficiently, we tend to use more of it. And so that's also considered slightly low leverage. And renewable energy equivalence, as I mentioned before, it's not just moving from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. Renewable energy still incurs some greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps not necessarily as many, but they're not greenhouse gas emissions free. So this is usually in their manufacturing. So there'd be slightly lower leverage for reducing greenhouse gas emissions unless combined with reducing overall energy demand as well. So those are some of the lower leverage points, just tweaking around the average and around the edges. And as you can see, potentially the types of interventions which feature often prominently in the political discourse or the policy debate. So provocative and important to have them framed this way. At the medium level, sort of more the change the rules of the system. Some examples that we're identifying was, switching attitudes around electricity, treating electricity as a precious resource, not just something we need to produce more of with wind or solar. That will encourage both lower energy farming practices and potentially higher density and higher energy efficient housing, which has an impact over time on increasing housing density and reducing the land used for further suburban or urban area, and the associated conversion of high quality agricultural land near urban areas. We also suggest coordinating NPSs to be collectively consistent. So an NPS is a national policy statement. So these are policy guidance which is issued by our central level government or the federal level government in Australia, and all local government policies should be consistent within those. So there's usually one for water management, there's some for highly productive land, there's some for urban development. They're across a range of areas. However, they're not always necessarily consistent with each other, and sometimes can conflict or can perhaps contest against each other. So Resolving some of those tensions would support their coordination and implementation. And thirdly, reducing fertilizer dependence. Fertilizer use is a key driver of intensification of farm activity and directly has an impact on water. It also has a direct impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So the link from fertilizer use and nutrients on waterways is definitely in the grey area in terms of usually incorporated in freshwater policy discussions. But the greenhouse gas emissions component of it is not. It has both greenhouse gas emissions in its production, and once applied to land, it oxidizes into nitrous oxide, which itself is greenhouse gas. And so that has a much longer, of course, global feedback through to the availability or the amount of fresh water which is in the system due to global climate change. In the deeper leverage points that change the goals of the system, we articulated things like helping people recognize that they are part of nature and not apart from it. So this involves a change in mindset to acknowledge that our relationship with and dependence on the natural world is not one of hierarchy, it's one of mutual connectivity. In fact, perhaps it is more dominant over us. The natural world will survive whether we are around or not, but we won't survive if the natural world is not around. Very much the second one is very much a New Zealand issue, but I do believe it probably appears in Australia and elsewhere as well, but definitely a very strong one in New Zealand. So seek to change the dominant culture of building wealth through housing. Over time, so this would mean a move away from suburban and lower density forms of housing. So this cultural identity as a nation in New Zealand, certainly, I'm sure Australians can relate to this, that our cultural identity is very much connected to our houses and suburban section and a piece of lawn and a garage, etc., etc. Slowly moving away from that would mean reducing urban sprawl, increasing less lower density forms of housing, increasing density, which would release some of the pressure on near urban agricultural soils, and also reduce reliance on private cars for transport, which has a greenhouse gas link, which has a feedback loop, of course, back to water in the system if water processes and climate, and through availability of water. And thirdly, seek to change the focus of asset management to appreciating assets, or at least to include appreciating assets. And this is just worth a moment of discussion here as well, because at the local government level and the central government level, actually, to be fair, all municipal and government spending is sort of focused around the concept of depreciation. You get an asset, a road, a dam, or whatever it is, a building on your books, and then that will depreciate over time. All of accounting processes are set up to deal with that. And capital expenditure can be allocated and borrowed and provided by central government to local government for capital investment. Green assets like trees grow. Green assets like trees appreciate. And the asset management system doesn't know how to handle this because they don't depreciate. So they are considered operational expenditure. And you can't lend or borrow for operational expenditure, and local and central government can't give funds to local government for operational expenditure. Perhaps a few exceptions, but as a general rule, that's normally the way. So there is this inherent bias towards building more stuff, which has an impact on spread and sprawl, and hard infrastructure, which has an impact on freshwater outcomes. So those are examples of across the three levels of leverage points. When we'd identified them, three things were really interesting and typical of systems. So one is how many of the interventions that benefited water weren't obviously water related. Two, some of the interventions seemed counterintuitive or seemed like they would be deeper than they actually are. So kind of like perhaps the water storage example or some of the efficiency use rates ones there. And some interventions look doable or at least conceivable. Some look so far out of our power to change, but it is these ones that are often bigger picture, societal ones that are often at the root of many social and environmental challenges, not necessarily just fresh water. So managing to influence them would deal with a lot of things, not just freshwater issues. So those are some of the insights. Now, for a few ways that we think that this may be practical for people in their work, in the policy sense. First, find champions who can bring the bigger picture together. So remember, this is to a lay audience, people who aren't familiar with systems thinking, people who aren't commissioning system dynamics or systems thinking modeling, just people who are working in policy, people who are working in politics, people who are working in advocacy, whatever. So finding champions. Systems thinking will benefit what you do, but not everybody needs to be a systems expert. Different forms of knowledge generation are valuable and necessary to understand complex systems. So there's a role for systems thinking, complementing more analytical or reductive approaches to that provide good information. So we argue that for those who want to start bringing more systems thinking into their work immediately, team up. Find people who can bring the bigger picture together, who can help take the important things from all those magnifying glasses and stitch them together in some meaningful fashion. Second, look at interconnections. So in the system maps and the broad underlying issues that are highlighted, there are multiple areas of interconnection. And these points of crossover can be crossovers between departments. There might be crossovers between local or regional or central government authorities, or between policy statements, as I talked about before, policy guidance. So use those crossover areas to identify existing and new colleagues with which to start a discussion. Think about how that work, people's work might affect each other and see what they might work on together. And third, consider multiple pathways. Any significant change in our freshwater is likely to be the result of interventions on multiple levels. And this is there is no silver bullet, but there are lots of silver shotgun pellets sort of approach. Consider what your work or what your organization is trying to do, what sort of outcomes they're trying to achieve. Does the work fit in to any of the described leverage points in the report? And now consider whether there are other pathways that you could use or other leverage points that you could use to try to intervene to bring around desired results, multiple desired results. Remembering that different interventions in the true sense of leverage are capable of to different degrees of change. Some interventions might be very direct and obvious and may have an immediate impact, and others may take time to take effect, that may be less obvious or harder to do. And we contend to a lay audience, this is the power of systems thinking. It can help illuminate multiple potential pathways and opportunities, giving us more tools in the toolbox for addressing issues. So that is the end of the presentation that myself and my colleagues put together in a summary of the report that we have written. We hope that for all sorts of audience, particularly the policy audience, or not just freshwater policy audiences in New Zealand, potentially Australia, that it helps them recognize sometimes when they might be looking through the magnifying glass and when they might need to look through a magnifying glass and when they might need to put down the magnifying glass to look at some of those broader influences. So I will pause there. Thank you very much for your time. And yeah, let's have a discussion and some questions. And I'm happy to go into the CLD as well, if anybody would like. And I can paste the link to the report in the chat real quickly.
Yeah, yes, please.
I'll do that maybe whilst Hussein starts gathering some questions.
Yeah, I myself have a couple of questions regarding the process and CLDs. I will ask when you presented those. But yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Just trying to find the chat function first. I paste this link into the chat. Hopefully everybody can download that report, or anybody who wants to. Any questions?
Hussein, Justin via Hussein. Thanks very much, very interesting. I did have a chance to read the report, and I'd commend that to anybody to go and have a look at. What particularly jumped out was how succinctly and clearly you were able to lay out systems thinking for novices. And so many of the audiences we deal with, as you've correctly identified, there's a great resource there that's available for all of us. So well done on that.
Thank you very much.
Secondly, just loved the use of imagery and symbols in the CLD. And I had a question for you just about that, because I'm working with a similarly complex one, about how you, excuse me, how you sort of viewed the different loops, and whether in the process of doing the research you were able to identify which of the loops,
You hear me?
I guess when you think about in the simulation side of things, people talk
So,
about.
sorry, Stephen, I just had some connectivity issues. You cut out just as you were starting to ask your question. I'm sorry. Could you start from the question part again?
I'll be more succinct. So loop dominance is a big deal these days in terms of looking at the simulation model, SD use of SDs. I just wondered whether in doing the CLD in the depth that you have, you had, I guess, a set of hypotheses about where the more dominant loops might be.
Yeah, great question. The short answer is no, we didn't have an explicit thought on that. We were coming more from the point of view that these other loops and pathways of influence are definitely having an impact. Not seeking to quantify it, but hoping that if people could at least start having the conversation that some of those other things are included, depending on what's going on in their regional area, because there will be some regional variance depending on, you know, the loop dominance for sure. They might be able to unpack that from just a qualitative discursive sort of approach, or they might be able to use this to inform some of the more complicated models that they actually do use in the freshwater policy development space. So there are a lot of you know, computational models. They're not usually system dynamics based, but they're usually other forms based. So I suppose we hope that this will in part help people see potential things they could seek to add into those models. But that's not specifically quantifying or articulating the loop dominance component. Loop dominance was perhaps a little bit of a stretch for the lay audience, but it's an excellent question you raise.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I had the similar question, which was about the leverage points, that how you came to those leverage points. Are those just examples, or came from your study?
No, they came from the work. So and apologies again for not outlining a little more clearly the process. So we interviewed about 10 subject matter experts who sort of fitted into or butted up against the freshwater policy space. Actually, at least one of those was sort of a senior manager level who had been across a lot of freshwater policy. So it wasn't that it didn't include freshwater policies people, but it was a expert interview and then reflective process. So we were asking them what key or major trends they saw either presenting now or coming in the future that would be having an impact on freshwater and freshwater outcomes. And freshwater outcomes is a term used in policy development here specifically, but effectively it's, you know, how it applies to both water quality and water quantity and ecosystem health sort of aspirations. So it came from a point of view, what trends do people see as potentially being impactful? And then we went through a process of connecting those all together in a diagram, reflected the diagram in our draft report back to experts, you know, tweaked it a little bit, had it peer reviewed as well. And then progress from there. But it is effectively in a form of opinion piece, an expert informed opinion piece. I
was wondering how these the CLDs impact those experts to identify the leverage points. Yeah. Or
sorry, yeah, was there more to the question?
No, no. My question is about how this process of modeling could impact experts to find the leverage points.
Okay, so you mean as in terms of the experts who we interviewed, or the lay audience who we hope to now present it to? I'm interpreting your question as relating to the experts who contributed. Is that correct?
It is kind of, yeah, but I had a similar experience of asking before these mapping exercise from the experts, what are your ideas about leverage points? And then after the mapping, the answers was a bit different. I just wondering if you got the same experience.
Just trying to think. This is not a deliberately evasive answer, but I'm going to say yes and no. It depends on the expert. So some leverage points came from literally the inspiration, or the observation rather, that some experts were providing. Some particularly women in the engineering space, who is from the energy space, and particularly that energy transition stuff we talked about. She was very good at hovering right back and going, actually, there's some attitudinal and value set things that are driving a whole bunch of behaviors, both across freshwater and others. So it was a matter of kind of incorporating those that she had highlighted, and others were more taking the things that they had said and then us providing a lens on how we viewed those as leverage points and reflecting them back. And then for some of them, perhaps it was more an experience of, okay, yes, I see what you've done, and I agree with the way that you have articulated that as a leverage point. Hope that answers your question, Hussein.
Yeah, thank you. We got 2 questions in the chat. Jackie asked, hi, Justin, can I ask how you thought building this CLD via key informant interviews versus group model building resulted in a different CLD? Particularly interested in the idea of building shared understanding through the process of group model building. And Emily, upon that question, Emily asked, building, I hope, on Jackie's question, from a project management and planning perspective, could you contrast group model building versus interviews in terms of what was involved time and budgeting wise?
Great questions. Thank you both. So the comments I would make around group model building and expert informed interviews is we were starting from quite a different point of need, perhaps is the best way of putting it. So we were seeking to produce effectively, as I said, an opinion piece. We could see that there's a lot of pressure for people to deal with freshwater issues, rightfully so, and other issues that policy experts, and folk are dealing with. But with all that pressure, sometimes that means that narrowing of focus. So we were deliberately seeking to widen that focus for people. Consequently, that means we weren't commissioned by somebody around a specific problem. This was an opportunity that we identified as a group of researchers, and so sought to highlight that. That lended itself more to the expert interview approach rather than the group model building approach, because the group model building approach, both are great. The group model building approach is particularly good at building social capital amongst a group of people, a greater shared understanding amongst a group of people. And if those people have closer and shared responsibility for an issue, perhaps at more regional or local scale, maybe national as well, I think that would lend itself more towards a group model building process if it was necessary for all those experts to have some role in implementing what came out of it. That was less the case for this one, in terms of we're effectively providing more of an opinion piece, and those experts were scattered all around the country. And remember, not specifically freshwater focused. So we were seeking to complement the knowledge in the freshwater policy space with perspectives from those people. So that lended itself more towards the expert interview approach. I think that deals with most of the first question, does it? And then Emily, you were asking, great to see you here, by the way, just acknowledging my Te Pūnaha Mātini colleagues. So I'm involved with a Centre of Research Excellence around complexity in New Zealand, and a few people are on the call. Thank you. The project management perspective, if I just get that question right. So so pros and cons of group model building versus expert interviews, was it? Or the slightly
Yeah, I
different
guess
approach?
just thinking about how long it took, what was involved, sort of comparing and contrasting. If you were going into a project thinking about which should I go down, you've already kind of helped to say, okay, well, it depends a bit on the aims, but also just the practicalities of what was involved, because I know you've worked on both.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. So yes, I've part answered your question with perhaps the answer to the earlier question in terms of we had a different intention, and my comments around how important is the group in implementing something, or how important is the group in influencing action about how something comes out. So maybe they're not people who need to be doing things on the ground, but they might have political influence or financial influence or some kind of sway within their organization as to what comes out of the process would have benefit. I think that lends itself more to a group model building process. A group model building process is more intensive for the people involved as well. So there was definitely a resourcing component in terms of respecting the time of people who we were approaching because we were interested in widening a conversation. So trying to be light with their time. So having a couple of, I think, started with a 1 to 1.5 hour interview. We recorded it, made loads of notes and that kind of stuff. Some reflecting back. So all up for them, it was a few hours of input over a period of time. Group model building process, from my experience, is a little bit more intensive. So it was partly that, and that has cost implications as well, of course. But the other implication from a output point of view is a group model building process, and in my personal practice as well, just to comment on that, I'm not always building CLDs live in a session. We're often capturing factors, capturing connections. I'll often build the CLD in between sessions. That's a little different to some people who might actively build the CLD in a session. I do a bit of both. But that's that's as opposed to that is more the output of people that were in the room in the discussion. The experts didn't interact. We interviewed them, so it's our articulation of how those things fitted together. So there's a slight further distance of ownership, I think, in terms of potentially the expert interview, which you need to reflect on as whether that's useful or not for your work. I hope that answers your question, Emily.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And Miriam?
Hi, and thanks. Justin, super interesting. I have a feeling I might write you something after this. I'm curious about the impact of it because I've just doing my PhD as well on the side, and you read always we hope that this will influence policy. We hope that this will, it's sort of like the last line on every system dynamics paper. I'm super interested in whether you feel that by engaging these people not randomly, but as experts and not part of a cohesive group, did you feel by publishing the report that there was a response coming your way from the system? Did they interact with it? Could they handle it? Because I have a feeling there's a lot of people interested, and then they see a causal loop diagram, and then they're like, oh my God, it's not a table, and everything shuts down.
There's definitely an element of that.
I'm curious how, whether there was any impact, I guess, observable that's a bit different from your regular consulting report.
Yeah, so great question again. So slightly different observable impact. And not something we're tracking or measuring in any way. So kind of just only observational sort of comments. But positive feedback so far. So the presentation I've given is effectively a replay of what they call a link seminar. So the Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, the Crown Research Institute, they often just give public webinars. And I think there was 300 odd people registered for that, which I think is a pretty good registration turnout for New Zealand. Not all in the nature of webinars, not everybody turned up, but some might be watching the video, and that's fine. We had quite a lot of unsolicited emails. Well, quite a lot. I don't know what quite a lot is. We had 6 between the three of us, I'd say. I think that's reasonable comments. And from that, already some people were saying great, and as well as comments online in the chat during the presentation. There was dozens of that saying, well done, great to see it. There were a few people that highlighted, brought other systems thinking approaches to our attention. So kind of almost like a community building component. And a lot of people reflecting on how they thought it would be really useful and was really needed in the wider conversation. But that's their feedback to us in terms of, I don't know how to measure that. We won't be able to track that longer term. But they were viewing it as a valuable contribution to the discussion that wasn't, whilst still complex, like the CLD in front of you, wasn't overwhelming people with the deep, modeling data that tends to happen in those sorts of processes. So that's the type of informal feedback we've had around how useful it would be.
Cool. Thank you.
And yeah, in classic report fashion, we hope it will have impact. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, and we have a question from Troy. Better awareness of Meadows' hierarchy of leverage points has taught us to focus on goals and paradigms, but perhaps decreased focus on stability. And New Zealand's policy system seems notoriously unstable, and ecologists would often argue that many weak interactions stabilize systems. Do you think better linking the policy system outside the gray outline in your CLD can improve New Zealand's policy stability?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, sorry, in terms of what was the component earlier on again? Is that in the chat, that question?
Yeah, in the
Maybe I
chat,
can go
in
to
the chat.
and see it myself.
Yeah.
So better, this is from,
It is. I'm
oh, is
here
it
if it
Troy?
helps.
Kia ora, Troy.
Kia ora.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you go back and look at some early TED Talks on systems,
Gotcha.
like from Eric Burlow, as an ecologist, and I think people would generally still say this, weak interactions tend to be the ones that stabilize big systems. And that makes me think, oh, well, Meadows stuff, we're often looking for the big transformational changes when we go up the hierarchy of leverage points. But it's also really important that we think about how to provide systems that are stable and make sense to people, so all the tweaking actually works out. And I'm wondering, having done this, if you think about, the instability in New Zealand's policy systems and the fact we tend to flip-flop between governments now, including around freshwater, do you think we might get better stability if people really did a better job of connecting up the whole system like you've started to look at in this effort?
Well, the short answer is, I think, yes. I think there's a slightly wider answer to that question as well, in terms of, I think some of the flip-flopping is symptomatic of some of the trends that some of the experts were talking about, decreasing trust in science, decreasing trust in policy, some of those sorts of things. I'm a strong personal believer in the increasing shared understanding power of using systems approaches. That doesn't mean it's easy, of course, but some of that stability of a policy setting, I think, is not necessarily shallow. I think that's more power dynamics, rules of systems. It's kind of in the medium to deeper components of the Meadows framework, personally. So I think there's and on a separate project, which I won't talk about, maybe that's a presentation another day, but it's been really interesting unpacking perceptions of Meadows and depth and leverage points with people. It's how people conceptualize what they are doing or where they fit in, and whether that's deep or shallow, and whether they find shallow offensive or not. It's quite a fascinating conversation. And I see a few nods from people, so that sounds like a similar experience. So yes, I think this has a role in building that, but I don't know if I would necessarily call them shallow or weak. I think some of those, certainly in the policy ecosystem space, I think some of that is quite values aligned and paradigm based.
Yeah, just to clarify that coming from ecology is really about weak and strong interactions between species and ecosystems. So it doesn't have that implied value associated with policy systems.
Gotcha. Sorry, no, my response was more in relation to the policy system. Sorry,
Yeah.
But also assuming within that grey area there'd be, deep detailed ecological knowledge that's contributing to some of those freshwater discussions. In some instances, maybe some of those weaker connections might be able to achieve outcomes. We was trying to highlight how these other things can be complementary to that, not discounting the discussion that's already going on in that space.
Mhm.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, Troy.
Yeah. Happy to talk more. Hope to see you up
Yeah.
in Toronto eventually. Yeah.
Yes, I'll be at the Hui next month, isn't it? Any other questions, comments, thoughts? If I may ask a question to the audience, I'm interested how our Australian colleagues perceive this. Like, is this something that sort of translates or wherever anybody's based, if you're not based in Australia, but non-New Zealand perspectives, do these sorts of comments and insights translate fairly well to other jurisdictions?
So, Justin, I lived in New Zealand for 13 years and been in Australia just a little bit longer. And I think as much as we tend to focus on differences, there are far more commonalities. And your comment about how the home as wealth, measure of wealth, is absolutely, it's on steroids in Australia. So I don't think New Zealand is unique in that.
No, we're definitely not unique in that. Yeah.
And then in terms of the political reactions, without getting into any party politics, be fair to say that those are always right down the lowest end of that leverage scale. And so I think that there are plenty of examples of where the unintended consequences that flow from that, those sort of responses are self-evident. So yeah, it certainly resonates.
Awesome, thank you.
Hossein, can I jump in?
Yeah.
So I've been in quite a few discussions the last couple of years, especially in the climate and health space, and the appetite for like going beyond is big in words. And as soon as you start a process, it goes down to reductionist toolkits. There's a lot of appetite like socially, but then when it comes down to business and down to actually creating something, there's still a lot of hesitancy as to, I want to produce it with the same methods I've used for everything else. It's like tension there. Or that's my observation, at least.
Yeah, no, I can personally relate to that. I'm sure many people can.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. If there isn't any other questions. No, not in the chat.
No.
Okay, thank you so much, Justin, and everyone for your questions and conversation we had. I'm putting in the chat the link to the chapter's website. Please get connected to us. And we have a monthly newsletter, so I'm putting the link to subscribing to that email list, and just letting you know that our next symposium is on 7th of February 2025 in Melbourne Business School. So it's good time to prepare something to submit, and hope we can see you all there in person. It is in person, and it is a hybrid symposium, but hope see you all there. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Happy to receive questions via email if anybody wants to email me.
Sure. See you, everyone. Bye.